Chris Gardner is a father who is persistent, honest, smart, high morale, and has big dreams to make his family happy like most of us. To make his dream come true, he dared to take the offer to become a distributor of advanced medical device. Chris dared to take risks, and use almost all of his savings were used to buy supplies of these medical devices, and have an exclusive marketing area in his city. After trying to market them, he realized that for most doctors, medical devices were quite expensive, and not needed. Even though at least he had to sell 2 tools to pay rent for his house, and also his daily living expenses. But this time, he has to be able to sell more than 2 tools, to pay for his car which was ticketed. The problem is that, until the end of this month Chris has not managed to sell a single tool. The presence of a child, and the ongoing cost of living, made Chris start to have financial difficulties. Linda, his wife, has to work 14 hours a day at the laundry, to help support the family's life. Meanwhile, his son Christopher, has to be put in a daycare center which is also cheap. One night, Linda started to get annoyed with Chris, because until that moment, Chris had not paid his tax bill. If not paid immediately, then the tax person will take all the money that is in their account. Whereas, the money in their account is only enough for living expenses for 1 month. That night, Chris listened to a TV broadcast that reported on the economic difficulties in his country, while trying to solve his son's Rubik's game. The next day when Chris started selling his tools again, he accidentally met someone who drove red Ferrari, and he asked 2 questions.
2 questions for you. What do you do, and how do you do it?
From that short chat, planted seeds of hope for realizing his family's big dream. Chris told his dream, it was a dream to be a broker to his wife. But the wife, who was still annoyed, mocked Chris, and told him to immediately sell all of his medical equipment, so that they could immediately pay the rent the house, which was due next week, where they had been in arrears for 2 months. After that brief debate, Chris started to sell his tools again. But this time, he tried to strengthen his heart, to dare to join the broker training program, organized by Dean Wooder Reynolds. He left his tool to a busker, and gave money in return. Inside, Chris met with the broker team. They explained that Chris had to meet someone named Jay Twistle, who was at the head office. In the middle of the chat, Chris saw the busker carrying his tool, so Chris was forced to leave the office, and immediately.
Why did I do that?
Excuse me. Hey! No!
Losing just 1 tool is like losing 2 weeks' living expenses for Chris. In the train, Chris saw the form given by the broker team earlier, where the program would only take 20 people every 6 months. Only 1 person will get a job, while Chris's last education is only up to high school. The next day, while Chris takes his child to daycare, Chris explains about writing happiness, which must use the letter I, so that the pronunciation can be correct. Then this innocent child even asks,
"Is fuck spelled right?"
After that, Chris was surprised by his son's question about some war films that he watched at the daycare place. Chris should have been given some lessons there. The daycare there is at the same time like a kindergarten school for children. Apparently the owner of the place purposely told Chris to watch a movie all day, because Chris himself was always late paying the daycare fee. After that, Chris immediately went to the broker training center, and waited all day to meet with Jay Twistle, to submit his application in person. Chris hopes that this person named Twistle will help, and support him to get a job. Due to waiting for Twistle, Chris was late to see one of the doctors, who had given him time to demonstrate his tools, even though the opportunity was very difficult for him to get. Lucky, the doctor still wanted to give a special for 30 minutes, but again his time had to be wasted, because he had to.
Wait!
This part here?
Hey! Wait! Hey! Wait!
As a result, his wife Linda had to see Chris home with 2 of his tools. Instead of selling, now he even added more inventory. After celebrating Christopher's birthday, Linda became even more angry and worse. This time Linda didn't want to care about what was going to be done, and what was going to happen to Chris. Their relationship becomes increasingly bad because of economic factors that continue to urge them. 1 month has passed since Chris sent his application letter for the training program. Today he accidentally encountered Twistle. introducing himself and reminded him of the application letter that was submitted a month ago. But because Twistle was in a hurry to leave, Chris finally lied that he also had plans to go to the same destination. Inside taxi, Chris tried to get to know Twistle by telling his story. But Twistle didn't care because he was busy finishing his Rubik's game. Until finally, Twistle was impressed by Chris, who could finish his Rubik game with the right time.
Are you going, sir? Excuse me, sir.
Chris's attempts to demonstrate his skill at work had failed. Now he was confused how he should pay the taxi bill, which was very expensive. While he only had $5, and even then is for his meal. Then at a red light, Chris ran away with his tool. He kept running until he reached the underground station. But when he was about to enter the train, in the middle of the night and heavy rain, Chris tried to call Linda and apologized that he would be home late. However, Chris had to get home soon, accompanying Christopher, because Linda herself was going to go to work. She was so upset that night. Linda decided to leave Chris and take Christopher with her. That night became a night of miserable for Chris. He started to think about the Declaration of Independence, about the right to live freely and pursue happiness.
That maybe happiness is something that we can only pursue, and maybe we can actually never have it.
When he got home, Chris could not find his wife and son. Now Linda really left him. In the midst of that sadness, suddenly Twistle called and gave good news. That the day after tomorrow Chris can take part in the broker training program interview. Twistle asked Chris to write down his secretary's number for more information. But because he couldn't find a ballpoint pen, he was forced to memorize Twistle's secretary number. After that, Chris hurriedly ran to a supermarket by continuously memorizing the secretary's number. There he immediately wrote the number, as well as asking them where Linda and Christopher were. Before leaving, Chris also had warned one of his friend, Wayne, to immediately pay his debt of $14. In the afternoon, Chris picked up Christopher at the daycare. Chris decided to stay with his son. Because he didn't want Christopher to have the same fate as him, growing up without a father's love. When the two of them were having dinner, suddenly the owner of the house came and said that Chris and his family had to leave the house tomorrow morning. Chris asked for time to pay for it. Luckily, the owner of the house gave him 1 week, on the condition that Chris had to repaint their house. The next day, when Chris starts painting the house, suddenly the police officers came and took Chris to the police station. Because until now Chris had not paid the parking ticket fine. The police were forced to arrest Chris and will release him tomorrow at 9:30 until all the problems are completely resolved. However, tomorrow morning at 10:15, Chris has to attend a broker training program interview. After that, Chris tries to call Linda and ask for help to look after Christopher. The next morning, after getting out of prison, in a very shabby condition, with a lot of paint on his body, he ran to Dean Westward's office.
Mr. Garner.
In that room, Chris met with Twistle and other high-ranking officials. In the interview process, Chris tried to remain calm and told the problems that fall upon him. Until he had to wear shabby clothes at that precious time. There, Chris told something and impressed the higher-rank officials.
If you ask me a question and I don't know the answer, I know how to find the answer, and I will find the answer.
After the interview, Chris decided not to continue the program. Because Chris just found out that during the 6-month training process, he would not be paid a dime. However, Twistle tried to convince him that this was a big opportunity for Chris. That night when Linda brought Christopher, Linda said that she would soon go to New York to his brother's place to get a better job there. Then Chris said that he had been accepted for the training program. The broker changed the day and Chris decided to move to a cheap motel, with the help of Wayne. After they were done, they both played basketball together. There the father advised his son and said that,
Don't ever let somebody tell you you can't do something. Not even me. You got a dream, you got to protect it. People can't do something themselves. They want to tell you you can't do it. You want something, go get it. Period.
Long story short, Chris finally decided to continue his training program, even though he was not paid at all.
You will be pulling from 60 Fortune companies. We need you to match their needs and goals to one of our many financial plans.
From that training, Chris got a lesson. Where so many calls equals many opportunities. So many opportunities equals more customers. The more customers, the more money. Chris with high spirits, he keeps trying to find many clients to get the job. He had to compete with 20 people who have a history of high education. During break time, Chris accidentally meets someone who carried his medical device, which he left at the train station. The break time is only 10 minutes, and he used it to take back the medical device. But unfortunately, when he was trying to catch up to that person, suddenly, the impact was so hard that Chris didn't feel it for a moment. He got up and looked for his missing shoes. He has to go back to the office wearing only one shoe. On the following training days, Chris feels that he is very low and unappreciated, since one of his managers always tells Chris to get something like a waiter. But Chris still doesn't give up. He always smiles through the day, even though his day was really tough. Chris must be able to divide his time between taking care of his son, training his broker, and also selling medical equipment to help with his living expenses. So he had to work 6 hours at the training. Even to maximize his 6 hours, Chris doesn't drink too much water, so he doesn't waste his time going to the toilet. After 2 months, Chris has not reached the target that has been set. He finally ventured to offer his services to Mr. Robin, the #1 businessman in his area. Apparently that courage paid off. Mr. Robin gave Chris the opportunity to immediately meet him within 20 minutes. But again, that good opportunity had to be wasted when his manager forced Chris to park his car. But Chris did not want to give up. He finally ventured to meet Mr. Robin at his house during the holidays with his son. There, Mr. Robin appreciated Chris' efforts, but he could not use the services offered by Chris because he felt he did not need them yet. When Chris and his son were about to leave, Mr. Robin asked Chris and his son to watch a baseball game, which Chris himself had promised Christopher to watch. There, Mr. Robin introduced Chris to his business friends. In the following months, everything seemed to run smoothly. He has successfully sold all the medical equipment. Until one day, Chris received a letter from tax informing that the bank had taken all of his savings. Because Chris did not pay taxes, and at that time Chris was completely bankrupt. Because he only had 33 cents in his wallet. In the morning when he and his son were about to leave, the hotel owner shouted at Chris, telling him to pay the hotel rent immediately. Since there was no other choice, Chris finally collected his debt to Wayne. Wayne said that the debt had been paid off, since he helped him to move. In the park when Chris was daydreaming, suddenly he saw someone carrying his medical device, and thought that it might be the only one for him and his son. So Chris took the device back and planned to resell it. But that day Chris had not managed to sell it. Christopher complained he was tired, and had to continue to follow his father selling his tools. When one of the doctors planned to buy it, it turned out that the tool was no longer working, because one of the parts was damaged. In the end they were forced to go home empty-handed, and what's even sadder, when arriving at the hotel, it turned out that the motel owner had already taken out all of Chris's and his son's belongings. When Chris asked his son to go, suddenly,
Stop!
his last choice was Wayne. That night, Chris planned to stay at Wayne's house. However, Wayne didn't want to open the door for them. In the end, they went to the station with no destination at all. There Christopher fantasized, if only the tool he was holding was a time machine. His father tried to comfort Christopher by convincing that it was indeed a time machine. Then Chris told his son to press the button and close his eyes. And after that,
You gotta close your eyes, close your eyes. You see him?
Watch out! Watch
Whoa,
out!
oh my goodness, a T-Rex, that's get your stuff. A cave.
Okay.
We gotta find it. Get in.
apparently, it's just Chris' way to get his son to sleep, in a toilet at the station there. Chris tries to put his child to sleep, with only a tissue as floor sheet. And if someone wants to enter the bathroom, the next day, Chris returned to training with his suitcase and clothes to the office. Even though the problem he was experiencing was quite severe, he still tried to hide his problem from everyone. After returning from training, Chris asked his friend to allow them stay at her workplace. However, his friend refused because her workplace could only accommodate women and children. Luckily, his friend told him that there was a place that could accommodate the homeless, that opened at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Without thinking, Chris immediately went to that place. We can see that to stay at that place you have to queue very long. If the place is full, then you are forced to find another place. While waiting in line, there was someone who snatches Chris' queue, therefore, making him.
Come on, don't do this to me.
Luckily, a guard knows that it was Chris who was the first to queue. Finally, Chris and his son could sleep in a comfortable place. More decent than toilet stations. At night, the building guards have to turn off their electricity. So they have to sleep without any light, including that night without light, Chris still take the time to study. Hence, the employee eligibility test is coming up soon in the morning. Chris had to take all his belongings out of the place, so he left for training with his clothes and suitcase. Chris had to make the most of his working time, because he had to queue at the homeless shelter at 5 o'clock.
Come on! Come on!
Even for meal, Chris had to come to a church to get free food. Short story, the employee eligibility test exam has arrived. This is Chris' final test to be able to get a job as a broker. To be able to queue at the shelter, Chris must solve the questions quickly. Lucky he can get it. After completing all the questions, including essay questions. When he was about to pick up his son, he met one of the higher-ranking officer who had interviewed him. The high-ranking officer borrowed Chris money, because he forgot to bring the money to ride a taxi. Even though Chris only had one sheet of money left. That night when Chris told his son to sleep, suddenly his son asked,
Did Mom leave because of me?
Chris explained that his mother left of her own will, not because of Christopher. Hearing that, Christopher said that Chris was a good father. Chris, who was proud of his son, told his son to go to sleep. While he was still trying repairing his medical device, until it finally worked again. It was sold to one of the doctors in the area. After getting the money, Chris rewarded Christopher by renting a hotel overnight, taking his son on vacation at the beach. The next day when Chris returned to the training program, suddenly his manager called him and told him to immediately meet with the higher rank officers. There the officers reminded Chris that today was the last day for him. With a smile on his face, Chris tried to be strong to accept the decision. But apparently, the officers announced that this was his last day as an intern. Tomorrow he has to return to the office as a permanent employee. After starting his career at Dean Witter, now Chris has managed to set up his own financial services company, which he named Gardner Rich, and that's the end of the movie.